Did you know that the doctors were convinced that she had a tumor in her abdomen? But what they discovered at the time of delivery left everyone speechless. What happened was so inexplicable that, to this day, no one is sure how to explain it. It was a day like any other until the routine test turned into a nightmare. When she was about to be born, all the doctors were prepared to deal with something big and serious. But what actually happened, no one could have predicted. Get ready to hear the story in medicine of a battle for life and a surprising fate. Maria was anxious, but also full of expectations for the arrival of her baby. She had always imagined that pregnancy would be a joyful journey, but she could never have imagined that her life would be turned upside down so quickly. The initial pregnancy tests were fairly uneventful, but she felt optimistic about the results. Like any mother-to-be, she was taking care of every detail, making all the medical appointments, carrying out the routine tests, and preparing her home to welcome the child she had been waiting for. However, reality changed abruptly during a routine ultrasound, scheduled for the 6th month of pregnancy. At first, it seemed like an ordinary scan, a simple routine check to make sure everything was fine with the baby and the mother. But when the doctor looked at the ultrasound screen, his face immediately closed up. He didn't say anything straight away, but his eyes began to move rapidly from side to side, trying to understand what was there. A series of images appeared on the screen, and the doctor couldn't hide his surprise and concern. He began to look at the other monitors, checking for any errors in the equipment. There wasn't. At one point, he asked Maria to get up and lie down again, trying to take the scan from a different angle. When she did, the view became even clearer. The image showed a considerable mass in the child's abdominal region, something that no one could have predicted. The baby was in the right position, but the area around its belly looked distorted, as if there was something else there. The doctor remained silent, something very rare for someone who had seen practically everything in his medical career. Not knowing what was going on, the doctor asked Maria to wait while he consulted other specialists. Time passed and soon a group of doctors were in the room, analyzing the ultrasound, exchanging worried glances. After an agonizing time, one of the doctors approached Maria with a grave expression. He explained with heavy, slow words that the image showed a large mass, which could be a tumor, a cyst, or even a rare anomaly. He seemed to weigh his words, not wishing to alarm, but the mere mention of a tumor was enough to make Maria feel a chill in her stomach. She didn't know what to think, but she knew something was wrong. Everything seemed uncertain, and fear began to settle in her mother's chest. The doctor's recommendation was clear. Maria needed to undergo a series of more in-depth examinations. But over the next few weeks, the tension grew. With each new appointment, each new examination, the doctors became more certain that the child had something abnormal in her abdomen. They couldn't understand what exactly was going on, but the fear was clear. It would be something serious, and the options for treatment soon after birth seemed inevitable. The tumor or mass, however difficult it was to diagnose, indicated that there was something compromising the child's health. The words immediate surgery and intensive care became a constant warning in conversations with doctors. Maria and her partner Louise's anxiety grew with each appointment. As the due date approached, Maria began to wonder if she was really ready for what was to come. She didn't know what to expect. The fear was constant. With each passing day, she imagined the worst scenarios. And although she knew that medicine could help her, she didn't know if she would be able to face the worst. The fear of losing the child, of seeing her life transformed forever into a nightmare, was something that consumed her mind. She didn't know what the recovery would be like, or how she would cope with the pain of a possible loss. Everything was in the hands of the doctors, and that seemed to be the only certainty she had. However, Maria tried to remain optimistic. Even with the whole situation unknown, she clung to the hope that perhaps what was seen wasn't as serious as it seemed. Louise, her partner, did his best to support her. He was scared too, but tried to be strong so that Maria wouldn't become even more anxious. Together, the two of them spent hours discussing the baby's future, imagining what life would be like after all this was over. But the truth was that nobody knew anything. The diagnosis seemed a complete mystery. Time passed, and finally the day of delivery arrived. Maria went into labor with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She knew that whatever happened, her baby had to be born. She was ready to face whatever was necessary. The fear didn't go away, but the pain and anxiety began to be replaced by a sense of urgency. The child needed to be born, and Maria needed to know what was happening. At the hospital, the medical team was already fully prepared for what would be a high-risk birth. Doctors, nurses, anesthesiologists, everyone was there, hoping that everything would go as smoothly as possible. They knew that the child would be born with a possibility of urgent intervention, but no one was prepared for what would follow. What could have been a simple cesarean section to remove a tumor or cyst soon turned into something that everyone in the room would never forget. Maria's discomfort increased, but she kept fighting to keep her mind focused on what she wanted most, to see her son and know that he was healthy. During the delivery process, the tension built up. The fear of the unknown made every minute longer. When the baby was finally born, the doctors were ready to act immediately in case the mass was more serious than they expected. And then the moment arrived. The sound of the baby's cry, strong and forceful, echoed through the delivery room. Maria, who until then had been immersed in a sea of uncertainty and fear, felt a wave of relief wash over her. But this relief was short-lived, and soon the anguish returned. The doctor took the baby in his arms, examining him quickly, as if he would have to act at any moment. The medical team, experienced and quick, were completely silent. Maria couldn't see what was happening. She could only hear the rapid conversations between the doctors and nurses, and her mind, consumed by fear, began to imagine the worst. Luis was by Maria's side, trying to calm her down with reassuring words, but his gaze was also fixed on the baby. He felt the same anxiety, the same uncertainty, but he tried to hide it so as not to make matters worse. He knew that, at that moment, words couldn't alleviate the fear they were both sharing. And the silence, that unbearable silence, only seemed to increase the tension. The minutes seemed to drag by. The doctors still hadn't said a word. Suddenly, one of the doctors approached Maria and Luis, his face serious. His gaze, normally calm and controlled, now carried an emotional weight that Maria couldn't ignore. He knelt down beside the bed, looked into Maria's eyes and said, with a softness that barely concealed his concern, "The baby is fine, but we need to talk about what we've found." Those words hit her like a bombshell. The fear that she had tried to dispel in the midst of the turmoil of childbirth resurfaced with force. She looked at Louise, who was pale, and doubt gripped them both. What did "we needed to talk" mean? What was happening to the baby? The doctor, very cautiously, explained that the ultrasound image did indeed show something unusual, but to everyone's surprise, what was found was not a tumor or a serious anomaly, as had been feared. What was there, in that abdominal region, was something much more unusual and extraordinary than a simple cyst or mass. The doctor paused, analyzing Maria and Louise's reactions before continuing. He explained that the baby was born with a rare condition, a type of formation called parasitic twins. At first, it sounded terrifying, but the doctor insisted that the diagnosis was not the end of the world, nor a death sentence. In fact, it was an extremely rare condition, but with the right treatment, it could be corrected without serious complications. However, the impact of the discovery was profound. Maria, who had only hoped for the relief of having her baby in her arms, was now faced with a much more complex reality than anyone could have imagined. Parasitic twins are a condition in which, during pregnancy, one of the embryos does not develop properly, and parts of its body become attached to the normally developing embryo. In many cases, these parasitic embryos don't survive, but in Maria's case, the small formation found in the baby's abdominal region wasn't just a tumor. It was a kind of miniature body, a part of an embryo that wasn't completely formed, with bones, muscles, and even a small heart that was partially developed. Most surprisingly of all, the doctor revealed the condition had never been identified at such an early stage of pregnancy. The presence of this formation in the baby's belly was something so rare that, for a moment, the doctor himself found himself speechless. He was still trying to process what he had seen. The baby was fine, but what would follow from then on was a question of how to resolve this anomaly in a way that wouldn't cause permanent damage. Maria and Louise were in shock, but at the same time, what had seemed like a nightmare was being transformed into a challenge to be faced. At the moment, all they wanted to know was whether the baby would survive without complications. The doctor assured them that the child was stable, but that they needed to act as quickly as possible to remove the formation. For them, this was a relief, but there were still so many questions and so many fears. How would this happen? What kind of surgery would be needed? Would the baby be able to live a normal life? The medical team was fully prepared to deal with the situation, but there was still the fear that the surgery would be more complicated than they initially thought. Every step now needed to be taken with caution. While the baby remained under the care of the medical team, Maria and Louise began to wonder about the future. Would this baby have a normal childhood? Could it trust the doctors to perform the surgery without putting the child's life at risk? What else could be hidden? Uncertainty about the recovery, the risks, and the consequences of the surgery took over their minds. It was an emotional roller coaster where every slight advance was immediately followed by great concern. When the doctors finally started planning the surgery to remove the parasitic twin, Maria had to make the most difficult decision of her life. She would have to trust the doctor's judgment at a time of total vulnerability. But at the same time, she couldn't help thinking about the risks that the surgery could entail. And perhaps most difficult of all was the notion that, if not treated correctly, the baby could have health complications that would affect her quality of life forever. What Maria and Louise didn't know was that the journey was far from over. The weeks that followed would be filled with intense emotional moments. The surgery was scheduled, but the preparation for that moment seemed endless. The anxiety grew by the day. They were about to enter unknown territory, where anything could happen. And the worst part was that no one could predict with any certainty what the future held for them and their baby. The only certainty was that, whatever happened, Maria and Louise's lives would never be the same again. They were about to embark on a journey that would challenge them in ways they couldn't even imagine. The operating room was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor. Maria's heart was beating faster than ever, a mixture of hope and fear consuming her. The baby's surgery was about to begin. The doctors had already prepared, and Louise was sitting in the waiting room, waiting with his heart squeezed. He tried to stay calm, but thoughts kept running through his mind, like a whirlwind of doubts. He remembered the first time he held a baby in his arms, the relief of seeing it born, the fright at discovering the anomaly. Now he felt that it was all becoming even more real. The possibility of losing such a small, fragile little being was becoming an immense weight on his shoulders. Maria, for her part, couldn't help but wonder if her daughter would survive the procedure. How could she trust that everything would work out when the situation was so rare and unprecedented? Her mind was full of unanswered questions, and time seemed to stand still. She felt powerless, as if she were at the mercy of the doctors, trusting them to do what seemed impossible. And at that moment, she realized how vulnerable a human being can be, how life can change in the blink of an eye. All she wanted most was for her daughter to be able to live a normal life, away from the shadows of that rare condition. The surgery began with painstaking precision. The doctors were totally focused on what they needed to do, but even so, the tension in the air was palpable. With every movement, every cut, Maria felt as if her soul was being ripped out of her body. Louise, in the waiting room, looked at his watch and felt time slipping through his fingers, but he still tried to hold on. He didn't want Maria to feel his insecurity. He knew that the baby needed all the strength he could give her. The most distressing thing, however, was not the fear of losing the baby. It was what it meant for Maria and Louise. They were about to face a battle against the unknown. A battle that not only involved the doctors, but also their own emotions, their own limits. The fear of losing their daughter was mixed with the uncertainty of the future. And above all, there was the pain of not knowing if everything they were doing would be enough. The surgery lasted hours. Every minute seemed like an eternity, a psychological torture that no one could understand until they had gone through a similar experience. Louise, in particular, was completely immersed in a whirlwind of thoughts. He wondered what his daughter would become, what her life would be like, whether she would be able to walk like any other child or whether she would be marked by this condition for the rest of her days. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a mixture of frustration and love, impotence and hope. He knew there was nothing he could do but wait. When the surgery was finally over, the silence in the room seemed to have doubled in intensity. The doctors gathered around the table, analyzing the results of the operation. For a moment, Louise and Maria were paralyzed, their bodies tensed and ready to react to any sign, any movement from the professionals. When the main doctor approached, his expression, which had previously been full of focus and seriousness, now softened. He looked at Louise and Maria and, in a tone that mixed relief and yet a slight caution, said the words that everyone had been waiting for. The surgery was a success. The formation was completely removed and the baby is stable. Now we can focus on his recovery. A wave of relief washed over Maria. She collapsed, tears welling up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from immense relief, as if a 1,000-ton weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Louise, who had remained quiet throughout the surgery, was now unable to hold back his emotions. He hugged her tightly, feeling that the worst was over. They were still in a whirlwind of feelings, but at that moment they could finally breathe a little easier. The worst hadn't happened. The baby was alive, he was well, and all that remained now was to move on. However, not everything had been resolved. The baby would still have to undergo a period of intensive observation to ensure that there were no unexpected complications. Recovery would be slow, and the little girl would need constant care to ensure that the impact of the rare condition didn't affect her long-term health. But Maria and Louise knew that, despite the difficulties that might arise, they had overcome the biggest challenge. Their daughter's life was safe. The feeling of victory was in their hearts, but the journey was still far from over. The surgery and the recovery time would soon become a distant memory, but what that experience would leave Maria and Louise with, both physically and emotionally, would be something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They would learn every day the value of life, the value of every moment. And most importantly, they would learn that, despite the uncertainties, the pain and the fear, their love for their daughter was unshakable. Nothing else mattered. They had won the biggest battle of their lives. As the days passed, Maria and Louise began to realize that the real victory was not just in their daughter's physical recovery, but in the strength they had found within themselves. The fear that had consumed them before the surgery was now transformed into a feeling of immense gratitude. Life, which had once seemed uncertain and full of challenges, now had new meaning. Every smile from the baby, every little bit of progress, was a daily victory. They were learning to live with a new purpose, a purpose of unconditional love and courage in the face of adversity. Maria, who had previously been overwhelmed by fear and insecurity, now felt that she had overcome not only the battle for her daughter's health, but also the internal battle she had fought with her own feelings of powerlessness. Louise, for his part, felt that the experience had brought them together in a way he had never imagined possible. They had faced the worst-case scenario and had come out stronger together. The impact of this experience was profound. Maria and Louise knew that, from that moment on, nothing could be taken for granted. Life would continue to challenge them in unexpected ways, but now they were better prepared. They had seen the fragility of life and the strength of love, which made them resilient in the face of the coming challenges. Looking at their daughter, now safe in their arms, they knew that the most important thing had been achieved: survival, renewed hope, and the unity of a family that, despite the difficulties, remained steadfast. This experience would be a story they would tell all their lives, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testimony of overcoming, of unshakable faith, and of how love can overcome the greatest obstacles. They learned that, no matter how much life challenged them, there was nothing stronger than the strength of a heart willing to fight for life. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.